Hello and welcome to Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. Russia is accusing terrorist groups operating in Syria of getting ready to stage yet another false flag chemical attack. Moscow says the Jabhat al-Nusra terrorist group, along with members from other terrorist groups, are involved in this. Now, the chemicals, Moscow says, are being stockpiled in Idlib province in the northern de-escalation zone. The terrorists plan to use these chemicals against the people and then blame the Syrian government with the help of what Moscow calls a pseudo-humanitarian group, the White Helmets, who it says is an arm of the terrorists. Stay with us as we take a look at the latest that's taking place in Syria. Well, we're going to start it off by crossing over to Damascus and getting the latest from Press TV's Mohammed Ali. Mohammed Ali, tell me what you have on this story, the latest information.
Yes, according to Deputy Chief of the Russian Center for Reconciliation based in Hmeimim Air Base in Syria, Vadim Kolet, he said that they received information that terrorists of the al-Nusra Front are planning for a provocation in the de-escalation zone of Idlib by carrying out a false flag chemical attack, and then they plan to accuse and blame the Syrian army for carrying out such a false flag chemical attack. Now, according to Kolet, he said that terrorists of the al-Nusra Front, accompanied by members of the so-called White Helmets, transported 10 barrels of toxic substances to an area called Harem in Idlib over there in order to carry out this false flag chemical attack in the southern part of the Al-Zawiya mountain, also in the de-escalation zone of Idlib, and then accuse the Syrian army for such an attack. Of course, this is not the first time that Russia warns of such an attempt that terrorists are planning, of the al-Nusra Front, of course, in Idlib. And according to many analysts, every time terrorists of the al-Nusra Front feel or know that the Syrian army and its allies are preparing for an offensive to squash them in Idlib, they actually attempt to carry out such a false flag chemical attack because they want to invite some kind of foreign intervention or international pressure that would lead to perhaps stopping such a military operation. Finally, previously, we used to see in Syria exit deals in which terrorists get out via buses and then the government controls that area, terrorists go to Idlib. But now terrorists have no other place to go after Idlib, so they know that they're going to be killed over there.
All right, thank you so much, Mohammed Ali, for giving us the update on the latest situation taking place there. I'm going to cross over now to Budapest. Welcome my next guest, George Zamutli, Senior Research Fellow, Global Policy Institute, and author of Bombs for Peace. Thank you so much for being with us. Are you surprised? I mean, we're seeing the same MO being replayed time and time again. Your assessment of this, are you surprised at this repeat of this scenario?
No, not surprised in the slightest. As you say, we had this same scenario in 2017 and in 2018, and the Trump administration took the bait and launched bombings attacks. We know for certain that both of them were absolutely fake. The Syrian government was not responsible for the chemical weapons attack, and there is no reason, there was never any reason anymore that there was a reason in 2013 in Ghouta for the Syrian government to use chemical weapons when essentially it has won the war. So therefore, the only purpose of creating these incidents is to justify a U.S. Military intervention, a U.S. attacks against the Syrian government. And I'm afraid that it's quite possible that this will happen. We've already seen that the Biden administration has twice bombed Syria, and I would fully expect that if such a situation occurred again, that the Biden administration would take the bait and bomb Syrian government positions.
Well, let me turn to London. Welcome my next guest to Spotlight, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, historian and analyst, author of the new book, Organises, The Return of Russia to World Politics. Thank you so much for being with us. Now, I want to look at Moscow has blamed the terrorist groups, foreign handlers, for these acts. Let's talk about, in your perspective, your analysis of all of this, the biggest supporters of this terror and instability still in Syria are which players?
Well, there's no question about it that the terrorists in Syria, specifically Al-Qaeda and ISIS, would not have been the potent force that they once were during the Syrian conflict without the assistance of major powers in the world. And those major powers are many, but in particular, they are as follows: America, Britain, France, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. The terrorists, for a number of years during the Syrian conflict, advanced deeply into Syrian territory, conquering a number of Syrian cities, but in particular, conquering many Syrian towns, many Syrian villages. And the Syrian armed forces, which have been for decades now one of the best trained, one of the best equipped, and one of the best led in the Middle East, were faced with a deadly challenge from those terrorist groups. Therefore, it is simply inconceivable that those terrorist groups had been able to advance and deliver some very grievous blows to the Syrian army without the assistance of first-rate powers in the world. So, as I said moments ago, without the support of major powers in the world, and I would say most importantly of all, America and Britain, ISIS and Al-Qaeda would never have been the potent force that they once were in the Syrian conflict. And secondly, they never would have been able to inflict the grievous blows on the Syrian army that they once did. And they would never have been able to occupy the amount of Syrian territory that they once did.
Okay, well, George, now there was a chemical attack in Douma, Damascus suburb, and rebel-held area in 2018. The United States and the United Kingdom blamed the Syrian government for the attack and initiated airstrikes against government targets. Now, the Organization of Prohibited Chemical Weapons investigated, and as you know, there was much controversy internally with disagreements with the inspectors and even reports of cover-up. I want to talk about the importance of all this, the role the OPCW is playing actually in perhaps helping the terrorists, because we saw even some of the inspectors trying to come out and say they disagreed with the report, but basically they were shut down.
Yes, you've summarized it perfectly. That's exactly what happened. The actual inspectors who went to Douma did not find any evidence of the use of chemical weapons. And they wrote that in their report. But of course, this was not acceptable to the bureaucracy of OPCW that relies on the United States and the United Kingdom and the rest of them. And so they rewrote the report, but essentially completely falsifying the findings of the actual inspectors, the actual experts. So that's why there is no way that, if there is a chemical weapons attack and the OPCW again sends in their inspectors, there's absolutely no reason why we should believe in any way anything that the OPCW finds. And you're absolutely right. They do serve as the enablers of the terrorists, because they're there then to scream, oh, Syria used these terrible chemical weapons, and therefore then the United States and the United Kingdom can then triumphantly say, well, we have no choice but to act. So I think this is it's a great danger. But there is also a drumbeat that's going on right now. As you probably know, there was a debate at the United Nations Security Council about opening up additional border crossings to get, quote, humanitarian aid, unquote, into Idlib. So you can see that there is a kind of Western propaganda drumbeat taking place right now in Idlib, and that's why I think this is a very dangerous situation.
Well, Marcus, what about that? I mean, George just talked about this, the discussion in the United Nations about opening, as he said, so-called humanitarian corridor. Now, I want to talk about the role of these so-called international organizations and what has been happening in Syria. I mean, it seems as if what they have been doing is basically in support of these neoliberal regimes instead of being actually a player to try to control the situation and de-escalate. Your take?
Well, whilst the creation of the United Nations was an honourable and admirable one, the problem is not the United Nations per se. The problem lies with certain members of the United Nations who abuse bodies of the United Nations and mechanisms of the United Nations. And again, the two principal offenders are America and Britain. Washington and London use their immense global clout, both political, economic, military, and cultural clout, to penetrate bodies of the United Nations in order to use them as tools of Western foreign policy objectives. So I do not believe that there is a problem per se with the United Nations. The problem, as I said moments ago, lies with certain powerful countries in the world who abuse their membership of the UN to pursue their foreign policy objectives. And in the case of Syria, we see how Washington and London have unashamedly used the United Nations to provide cover for the terrorists in Syria, both Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The way in which the Americans and the British have used the United Nations to portray the so-called freedom fighters in Syria is really quite sickening. And it goes to show once again how the old maxim is correct: might is right. Because the Americans and the British know very well whom they are supporting in Syria. They know that the groups they are supporting are Wahhabist groups who are essentially ideologically the same people who carried out the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington in 2001 and in London in 2005 and in 2017 and in Bali and so on and so on.
Okay.
But of course, those terrorist groups are potent weapons of the Americans and the British, and they have used them in many conflicts, not just the Syrian one, but the Bosnian one too.
George, your take on what Marcus has said, and if you agree with what he's saying, I mean, what exactly does that mean? The same terrorist that has caused havoc in various Western cities is the same group that then these same capitals, London and Washington, are actually supporting in Syria. So what is it that the United States and the United Kingdom, what's the goal? What are they really after?
Well, the goal is regime change. And these terrorists, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda, are very useful to effect regime change. I mean, either they can wage a war ad infinitum, they can just debilitate a country and drain them, as it looked like it would happen in Syria before Russia made its very significant intervention in the fall of 2015, which arrested the progress of these jihadi terrorists. So either that or via these staged incidents, and therefore, which again then justify Western intervention. But of course, the longer these wars continue, then the longer or the greater the imperative within the Western capitals to continually apply further and further pressure against, for example, in this case, the Syrian government via sanctions. Because, of course, the Syrian government gets blamed for the war, gets blamed for the atrocities, gets blamed for everything that's gone wrong in Syria. And so, therefore, that serves to justify the horrific sanctions regime imposed by the United States and the European Union. And Marcus is absolutely right. There's no secret that the United States used ISIS in Syria and in Iraq. And we have John Kerry's confession on this score. We have Joe Biden's confession on this score. They're open about it. They used ISIS in order to topple Bashar al-Assad. It failed. They also used ISIS to effect a regime change in Iraq because the person was then prime minister. The Americans didn't care for him. So that's what happened. And Marcus is right. This was what they did, this same thing in Bosnia, and which then served. Again, there were all these sudden atrocities which always happen in the same place, and particularly at crucial moments in the war, and then then served the justification for NATO military intervention.
Well, Marcus, now Russia's previously talked about the role of the white helmets, this so-called, as they're talking about, presenting themselves as a humanitarian group, but Russia's talked about them serving actually the terrorist cells in Syria. I want to talk about the role of the white helmets in this and how they're getting away with really not even being condemned, not even being examined by the so-called mainstream media. Your take on this?
British state propaganda is formidable, and in my opinion, it is the foremost propaganda outlet in the world, and I would also say in recent times. And the White Helmets is just one example of that. The White Helmets, far from being a humanitarian organization, is nothing more than a propaganda outfit created and financed by the British state, not Britain, by the British state. The two are very different entities, created and financed by the British state to depict the Syrian government in the most awful of manners as a justification for supporting the so-called freedom fighters in Syria, and as a justification for the economic sanctions imposed by America and the European Union on the Syrian government. Now, the White Helmets, the creation of the White Helmets has been exceedingly successful in that it has convinced a great many people, in particular in the Western world, that this organization is a humanitarian one. However, it is quite easy to punch holes and large holes in the image which is projected by London of the White Helmets. So, for instance, why is it that the White Helmets, who purport to be a humanitarian organization serving the Syrian people, only operate in territories controlled by either ISIS or Al-Qaeda? If they were an organization serving humanitarian purposes in Syria, then they would be all over Syria. They would be in parts controlled by the Syrian government and in parts controlled by ISIS or Al-Qaeda. But they never have been in areas controlled by the Syrian government. So it is a very simple situation in which we find that the White Helmet is but a tool of the British state to further the objective of London and Washington in Syria, namely the overthrow of the Syrian government, the destruction of the Syrian state, the creation of a new Syrian state, which would be subservient to the West and compliant with Israel.
All right. Well, George, really quickly, 30 seconds. Where do you see this going? What is it going to take to actually bring peace to Syria again? And these Western regimes should accept their losses. We've just seen the Syrian people vote in a presidential election. What is it going to take to end the chaos there?
Well, you may not like the answer. My own feeling is that the only way that you can bring about peace in Syria is if the Syrian government, with the assistance of the Russians, makes the final move for Idlib and bring the Idlib under Syrian government control and finally rid the country of this Al-Qaeda. Now,
Okay, and on that note, I have to thank you both. So sorry, we're out of time. I appreciate you both being with us. Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, historian and analyst, author of the new book, Arise Russia, The Rise of Russia to World Politics, out of London, and George Zamouli, Senior Research Fellow, Global Policy Institute, author, Bombs for Peace, out of Budapest. And viewers, thank you so much for joining me right here on Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marcia Hashimi. Goodbye.